The morning I packed my bag to leave for what I thought was a peaceful retreat, I had no idea I was being sent into exile, while my own son orchestrated the complete destruction of everything I'd built in 78 years of life. The rain wasn't falling gently that morning in Riverside. It was coming down in cold, angry sheets that seemed to wash away any illusion I still had about my boy Daniel being the man I'd raised him to be. I am from Brampton. Where are you watching from? Because what happened next is a story every parent needs to hear, especially those of us who have spent our whole lives trusting the wrong people just because they share our blood. I stood in my kitchen, the one I'd shared with my late husband George for 35 years, zipping up my travel bag with hands that trembled just slightly. Daniel had been so insistent these past few days, so unusually tender in a way that made my heart swell with hope that maybe, just maybe, he was finally becoming the son George and I had always believed he could be. His voice still echoed in my quiet house, telling me I looked exhausted, that losing his father 2 years ago had carved lines in my face that wouldn't fade unless I got away for a while. He'd arranged everything himself. A trip to the old family farmhouse upstate in Millbrook, a place that had belonged to my parents and sat empty for the better part of a decade, gathering dust and memories in equal measure. Go enjoy the peace and quiet, Mom, he'd whispered the night before, kissing my cheek with what I mistook for genuine love. You need the country air to clear your head. Rebecca and I will handle everything here. Just drive up there, turn off your phone, and rest. Don't worry about a thing. I believed every word because that's what mothers do. We filter out the warning signs, ignore the inconsistencies, and tune our hearts to hear only what we want to hear when it comes from our children's mouths. I was halfway to my car, keys clutched in my aging hand, when the pounding started on my front door. It wasn't the gentle knock of a neighbor borrowing sugar. It was the kind of authoritative hammering that makes your bones vibrate and your blood run cold. My heart started racing as I moved toward the entrance, peering through the side window at what awaited me on my own front porch. 3 men in dark rain-soaked jackets stood there, and across their backs in bold yellow letters were 3 letters that changed my life forever. FBI. Behind them sat 2 police cruisers, lights off but presence undeniable, like silent witnesses to whatever nightmare was about to unfold. I opened the door with trembling hands, and cold air rushed in to meet the warmth of my home. The lead agent stepped forward, his eyes gray and hard as winter stones, flashing a gold badge that caught the dim morning light. Dorothy Harrison? He asked, his voice flat and clinical. I nodded, my tongue suddenly feeling like a dry stone in my mouth. I'm Special Agent Crawford with the Financial Crimes Division. We have a federal warrant for the seizure of this property and a summons for your immediate questioning regarding a multi-state bank fraud and money laundering scheme involving Harrison Capital Holdings. The words made no sense. Harrison Capital Holdings was something Daniel had mentioned months ago, showing me papers he said were just a state reorganization, Mom, to keep things simple after Dad passed. I'd signed them because he'd smiled at me with George's smile, and I'd wanted so desperately to believe my son was finally taking charge, finally showing responsibility. There must be some mistake, I whispered, my voice barely recognizable as my own. My son handles our financial affairs. He's away on business. Agent Crawford stepped into my foyer, his eyes sweeping over the family photos on the walls, the antique furniture George and I had collected over decades, everything we'd built together, and he looked at it all with the kind of professional indifference that made my skin crawl. Ma'am, your son Daniel Harrison and his wife Rebecca were flagged leaving the airport late last night on a private charter to a country with no extradition treaty. According to our records, you are the sole registered officer of Harrison Capital Holdings. Your signature is on loan applications totaling $2.5 million, all of which was funneled through shell corporations before disappearing into offshore accounts. This house, your retirement funds, every asset in your name was used as collateral. As of 8 o'clock this morning, this property is in federal receivership. The humiliation hit me like a physical blow. I stood in the center of my living room, the place where Daniel had opened Christmas presents as a boy, where George had held me after my mother died, and watched as federal agents began moving through my home, tagging furniture, opening drawers, treating the sanctuary of my marriage like it was a crime scene. And then Daniel's final words to me clicked into place like the last piece of a horrible puzzle. Go enjoy the old house, Mom. He hadn't sent me to Millbrook for rest. He'd sent me there because it was the only piece of property he couldn't easily liquidate, the one place where I'd be isolated and out of the way while the federal government tore apart everything I'd ever worked for. Rebecca's influence was everywhere in this betrayal. Her cold, calculating fingerprints were all over the sophisticated layers of fraud, the way they'd used my grief and trust as cover for their greed. I was a 78-year-old woman with a packed bag standing in the ruins of a 35-year life, and the only family I had left had just handed me a shovel, and told me to dig my own grave. The drive to Millbrook was a blur of gray highway and the mocking rhythm of windshield wipers. I drove because I had nowhere else to go. The agents had allowed me to take my car and one suitcase, their version of mercy, I suppose, a chilling reminder that I was now a person of interest in a criminal investigation. My bank accounts were frozen, my credit cards worthless pieces of plastic. As the city skyline faded behind me and gave way to rolling, desolate hills, the silence in the car became unbearable. Every mile took me further from the woman I used to be, the respected librarian, the neighbor people waved to, the friend people trusted, and closer to what I feared I'd become, just another number in the federal prison system. I thought about all the times I'd bylaid Daniel out of his minor setbacks. All the times I'd silenced George's doubts by insisting Daniel was just a late bloomer, that he just needed one big break. I'd funded his delusions with my silence and my signatures, and now that silence had cost me everything. The farmhouse sat at the end of a long, overgrown gravel drive, its white paint peeling like dead skin, the porch sagging under a decade of neglect. It looked like the skeleton of my childhood, smelling of damp wood and mouse droppings, and the heavy, stagnant scent of things left to rot. I stepped inside, and the floorboards groaned beneath my feet as if protesting my return. There was no electricity, the power had been cut years ago, and the air inside was colder than the rain outside. I moved through the kitchen in the dim light, seeing the rusted hand pump over the sink, the cracked linoleum, shadows pooling in corners like spilled ink. I was 78 years old, and I was starting over in what felt like a tomb. As night fell, thick and absolute, I huddled in my wool coat on an old moth-eaten sofa, the only light coming from a battery-powered lantern I'd found in my trunk. The silence of the country wasn't peaceful, it was predatory, a vast echoing emptiness that amplified every terrible thought in my head. I kept hearing Daniel's laugh from his wedding day, the way Rebecca had looked at my house in Riverside with a proprietary gleam even then, the subtle ways she'd criticized my old-fashioned attachment to George's things. They'd played the long game, eroding my confidence, feeding on my grief until I was too tired to read the fine print, too desperate for their approval to question the documents they slid across my dinner table. My own son had looked me in the eyes and used his father's memory to facilitate a theft that would leave me destitute and potentially imprisoned. But as I sat there in the freezing darkness, I felt something unexpected, a white-hot spark of fury in the center of my hollowed-out chest that the cold couldn't extinguish. I was Dorothy Harrison, a woman who'd managed a city library system for 30 years, who'd raised a child on a librarian's salary, who'd stood by her husband through 3 bouts of cancer, and I would not be buried in this dirt. I remembered George's voice, his quiet strength, the way he always said that information was the only true currency in a world full of thieves. Daniel and Rebecca had made a critical mistake. They believed that because I was old, I was obsolete. They believed that by stripping me of my home, they'd stripped me of my power, but they'd forgotten I was the one who kept records. I was the one who understood filing systems, who knew how to organize information, who'd spent 40 years helping people find what they were looking for in millions of books. The next morning, I woke to the biting chill of an Illinois winter and performed the mandatory tasks of survival, washing my face with ice-cold water, eating a dry granola bar with mechanical efficiency. Then I began to search the house, not for comfort but for leverage. This farmhouse had been in my family for 4 generations. My father had been a man of hidden compartments and quiet contingencies, always preparing for hard times. I climbed the stairs to the attic, the air thick with century-old dust, and began moving trunks and forgotten tools. I found it behind a loose stone in the chimney, a small, heavy iron box, rusted at the hinges but still defiant. Inside were not jewels or cash, but something far more dangerous to Daniel's plans: original land grants and mineral rights surveys conducted 50 years ago. My father had discovered a vein of rare earth minerals on a small detached 10-acre plot near the river, land that had been lost in tax records due to a clerical error in the 1960s. Daniel, in his frantic greed to seize the primary estate, had missed this completely. He hadn't bothered looking at what he considered worthless rural holdings. This land was legally mine, unencumbered by the federal lien, because it had never been declared as part of Harrison Capital's collateral. It didn't exist on any modern spreadsheet. As I stared at those yellowed maps, realization bloomed like a cold, beautiful flower. I wasn't a victim trapped in a concrete box. I was a general setting up operations, and I had ammunition my enemies didn't know existed. I needed a lawyer, but not a city shark. I needed someone who understood the old power structures of Illinois, someone who knew how to dismantle the very kind of financial predators Daniel had become. I remembered a name George had mentioned years ago: Marcus Brennan, a retired litigator who lived in a restored Victorian on the Hill in Millbrook. The walk into town was 3 miles of freezing wind and gravel, but I didn't feel the ache in my knees. I walked with the cold, unflappable composure of a woman who'd already seen the bottom and decided she didn't like the view. I found Marcus Brennan's office, a quiet, mahogany-scented sanctuary that smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco, much like the library George had loved. Marcus was in his late 70s with kind but shrewd eyes and a posture that remained impeccably upright. "Mrs. Harrison," he said as I placed the iron box on his desk, my fingers blue from cold but my gaze level. "I've read the news. The papers are calling you the architect of the Riverside fraud. They say you're hiding out here, waiting for the storm to pass." I sat in the uncomfortable wooden chair across from him and leaned forward. "Mr. Brennan, I'm a 78-year-old librarian whose son just used her life as a human shield. I'm not hiding. I'm preparing a counterstrike." I opened the box and slid the mineral rights survey toward him. "Daniel Harrison thinks he's neutralized me. He thinks he's won $2.5 million in my silence. He's dangerously mistaken." Marcus adjusted his glasses, and I watched his expression transform from professional distance to sharp, burning interest as he reviewed the documents. "Do you know what this is, Dorothy? These aren't just old surveys. This is the deed to a strategic resource the state's been trying to locate for a decade for their green energy initiative. If this land is where these maps say it is, its value dwarfs the debt your son incurred." He looked up, and for the first time I saw a flicker of the legal titan he'd once been. "They believe you're defeated, isolated, and broken. We need to let them continue believing that. We need Daniel to be overconfident." He leaned back, fingers interlaced over the file. "For the next 2 weeks, you'll live in that farmhouse. You'll be the defeated widow the prosecution expects to see, but you won't be alone. I have a direct line to the U.S. Attorney's office, a woman who owes her career to a favor your husband George once did for her father. We're going to turn your son's Harrison capital into a federal wire fraud trap that will bring him and that viper he married to their knees." He pushed a clean notepad and pen across the desk. "Start by writing down every conversation, every signature Daniel streamlined past you, every offshore account Rebecca mentioned. We aren't just clearing your name, Dorothy. We're reclaiming your life." I took the pen, and the weight of injustice and the relief of an unexpected alliance coalesced into a single burning purpose. The war for my soul, for George's legacy, for the truth had officially begun. Over the next 2 weeks, I lived in that freezing farmhouse like a monk in meditation. I ate hard bread and canned soup, hoarding my meager supplies. Every time my stomach cramped with hunger, I thought of Daniel and Rebecca at some luxury resort, drinking champagne and laughing about the old woman rotting in the woods. But I wasn't rotting, I was sharpening. I spent hours in the attic going through every scrap of paper I'd brought from Riverside, finding patterns. Rebecca's handwriting on sticky notes attached to the most damaging documents. Daniel's rushed signature always paired with dates when I'd been elsewhere, at the cemetery visiting George, at a friend's hospital bedside, anywhere but home. They were arrogant. They thought I was too distracted by grief to notice timelines, too technologically illiterate to understand digital breadcrumbs. I met with Marcus again, this time with a notebook full of discrepancies. "They forgot I spent 30 years managing a library system," I told him, my voice steadier than it had been in months. "I know how to find things people try to hide. I found discrepancies in the wire transfers." Daniel was using my old laptop to access the accounts, but he forgot the IP address would show he was at his condo downtown, not at my house. Marcus smiled grimly. "You're doing more than surviving, Dorothy. You're building a RICO case. If we can prove Rebecca set up those Cayman Islands shell corporations using forged power of attorney documents, we don't just clear you, we bury them both." We began feeding information to Marcus's contact in the U.S. Attorney's office, a prosecutor named Detective Sarah Walsh, who'd been looking for a way to crack Harrison Capital for months. I provided recordings, digital trails, geological surveys proving the motive for the second wave of fraud. I was the bait and I was the hook. One night my burner phone rang. It was Daniel, his voice smooth and oily with false concern. "Mom, how are you holding up? I know it's tough, but Rebecca and I are working so hard to clear this mess up. Just stay put, okay? Don't talk to any lawyers. Don't make things worse for us. We'll come get you as soon as the heat dies down." I stayed silent for a long moment, listening to him breathe. "I'm fine, Daniel," I said, my voice emotionless. "The house is quiet. It's exactly what I deserve, isn't it?" There was a flicker of hesitation on his end, a crack in his armor. "Just stay there, Mom. For your own good." When I hung up, I felt a cold peace wash over me. He'd just confirmed his guilt on a recorded line. He wasn't worried about me. He was afraid of me. The turning point came when Rebecca's private investigator showed up at the farmhouse. A man named Miller with dead eyes and expensive shoes, he walked up to my sagging porch with papers for me to sign, a voluntary relinquishment of the Millbrook property to Harrison Capital in exchange for a spot in an assisted living facility in Florida under a different name to keep you safe from the authorities. The audacity was breathtaking. They wanted the farmhouse too. They wanted me silenced in a gilded cage in a state where I'd have no legal standing. I looked at Miller with watering eyes, not from grief, but from the cold wind and the sheer effort of deception. He wants me to go to Florida, I whispered, my voice cracking. He thinks I can't take care of myself. Miller nodded with a patronizing smile. It's for the best, Dorothy. The federal case is getting ugly. This is your only way out. I took the pen with shaking fingers and signed the name Dorothy Harrison in an unsteady scrawl, but beneath the table, I pressed the record button on my device. He just delivered a verbal admission of witness coercion on tape. When his SUV disappeared down the drive, I walked back into the kitchen and sat in the dark. The signature I'd just given wasn't surrender, it was a legal poison pill. Marcus had prepared a specific clause in the original family land grant preventing transfer of the property to any corporate entity without a 90-day cooling-off period and mandatory environmental audit due to the hidden mineral status. By signing those papers, I hadn't given them the land. I triggered a legal alarm that would freeze all of Harrison Capital's assets for investigation. I just locked the doors of their own vault from the inside. 3 months later, I sat in a federal courthouse in Chicago, no longer wearing my wool coat and shawl. I wore a modest navy suit and sat with Marcus Brennan on one side and Detective Walsh on the other. Daniel and Rebecca sat across the aisle, flanked by lawyers who looked increasingly nervous as the morning progressed. When Marcus revealed the mineral rights documentation, when Detective Walsh presented the recordings of Rebecca's investigator attempting to coerce a federal witness, when the forensic accountants showed how every wire transfer originated from Daniel's condo while I was documented as being elsewhere, I watched my son's face drain of all color. The sophisticated fraud scheme collapsed like a house of cards. Rebecca's shell corporations, the forged power of attorney documents, the offshore accounts, all of it exposed in brutal clinical detail. Daniel tried one last desperate plea as they led him toward the door in handcuffs. He looked at me with those eyes that used to be a little boy's eyes, filled with shock and pathetic hope. "Mom, please," he whispered. "You can't do this to me. I'm your son." I stood up, my posture straight, no longer needing to play the fragile widow. "You stopped being my son the moment you used your father's memory to steal my life, Daniel. Now you're simply a man facing the consequences of his choices. I'm not doing this to you, you did this to yourself. I'm simply the one who kept the records." Rebecca was led out next, her face a mask of cold fury. She didn't look at me, she was already calculating how to blame everything on Daniel. But the digital trail ensured she'd be walking the same path to a federal cell. The drive back to Millbrook that evening was different. The city lights reflected off wet pavement like scattered diamonds. I went to the farmhouse, my farmhouse, and walked through rooms that no longer felt like a prison. I spent the next few weeks working with Marcus to finalize the mineral rights sale. The funds didn't just pay off legal fees. They established the Harrison Dignity Fund, a foundation for elderly victims of financial abuse, a legacy for George that meant more than any house ever could. The people in Millbrook began to look at me differently, not with pity but with respect. I was the woman who'd fought the federal government and her own son and won, the librarian who'd outsmarted the sharks. As I sat on my restored porch one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of violet and gold, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. I'd lost a son, but I'd found myself. I'd lost a home only to realize that home isn't a building, it's the integrity of the soul. The scars would remain. The memory of Daniel's betrayal would always be a shadow in my heart, but those scars were now my medals of honor. I was Dorothy Harrison, and I was no longer afraid of anything. I'd faced absolute betrayal and found the sun within. The path from victimhood to agency isn't quiet, it's a violent, necessary upheaval of everything you thought you knew about love and loyalty. For 40 years, I'd believed my role was to absorb blows for those I loved, to be the soft place for Daniel to land. But in the cold light of that farmhouse, I learned that true love requires the strength to say no, and true loyalty is to the truth, not to a person who hides from it. By holding Daniel accountable, I performed the ultimate act of motherhood. I finally forced him to grow up, even if it was behind iron bars. I reclaimed the power of my own narrative, writing an ending that wasn't about a mother's broken heart, but about a woman's unbreakable will. I looked at George's photograph one last time and felt him smiling, not because I'd won, but because I'd stood up. I'd defended the name he'd given me and the life we'd built together. Winter arrived in Millbrook with fierce, quiet beauty. The farmhouse, now sturdy and warm, stood against howling winds like a sentinel. I spent long evenings by the fireplace reading books I'd saved, and in one I found a letter George had tucked away years ago when Daniel was still a teenager. "Dorothy," it read in his steady script, "never forget that you are the anchor. The waves will come and the wind will blow, but as long as you know where the shore is, we'll never be lost." I held the paper to my chest, and tears came, not the hot, stinging tears of betrayal, but the soft, healing rain of grief that had finally found peace. George had seen the strength in me long before I was forced to find it myself. A letter arrived from the correctional facility where Daniel awaited sentencing. I stared at the envelope for a long time before opening it. Inside was a desperate plea for a character reference, a request for me to tell the judge about the boy he used to be. He spoke of Rebecca as the one who led him astray, still shifting blame, still hiding. I picked up my pen and wrote a single sentence in response. "The boy you used to be is a memory I'll always cherish, but the man you chose to become is someone I no longer know." I didn't send a reference. I didn't offer a lifeline. To do so would have been an insult to the journey I'd completed. I was no longer a soft place to land. I was the hard truth he needed to face. The community in Millbrook changed around me. I became a fixture at the local library, volunteering to organize historical archives. I began hosting small gatherings at the farmhouse, inviting other women who'd lost husbands or felt invisible in their own lives. We talked about autonomy, about the law, about the importance of keeping your own keys. I realized the education I'd gained through trauma was a gift I could share. I was teaching them that aging isn't a process of disappearing, but a process of refining, like minerals in the ground, compressed by time and pressure until we become something indestructible. As spring peeked through melting snow, I walked to the edge of the property where the mineral plot sat. The state had begun preliminary work with a respect for the land I'd insisted upon in the contract. I stood on the ridge looking out over the river, feeling a lightness that was almost holy. My life in Riverside was a closed book, a beautiful story with a tragic middle and a triumphant ending. I didn't miss the suburban comforts or the social circles that vanished when the handcuffs clicked. I preferred the cold, honest wind of the country and the company of people who knew the value of a hard-earned reputation. I'd lost my home, my money, and my son, but in the ruins I'd found Dorothy, and Dorothy was more than enough. By the time the lilacs bloomed, the final legal hurdles were cleared. The Riverside house was sold, debts settled, and the Harrison Dignity Fund was thriving. I sat on my porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of violet and gold. The scars were still there, a permanent ache whenever I saw a mother and son laughing in the park, a sudden chill when I heard a voice like Rebecca's. But those scars didn't define me anymore. They were the topography of my survival, the map of a journey that had led me back to my own strength. I was 79 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was completely, unapologetically free. I'd survived the darkest valley of the soul, and the view from the other side was breathtaking. The old farmhouse stood gleaming in twilight white paint fresh, and I knew it would stand for another 100 years. It had survived neglect, storms, and an attempt to turn it into a prison. It was a home again, and so was I. I walked inside, the floorboards offering a familiar, welcoming creak, and closed the door. I didn't lock it out of fear anymore. I locked it simply because I was the one who held the key, and I was the only one who decided who entered my sanctuary. The journey through trauma isn't a straight line, but a spiral that leads us deeper into ourselves than we ever thought possible. To face the betrayal of your own blood is to stare into an abyss that threatens to swallow every good memory. Yet it's precisely in that darkness that we find the iron within, the part of us that cannot be stolen, forged, or broken. I learned that the ultimate form of self-care isn't comfort, but the fierce protection of your own dignity and legal autonomy. Forgiveness isn't a gift we give to those who hurt us. It's the act of unburdening our own hearts so we can walk toward the light. I carry my history not as a weight, but as a foundation. The woman I was before the storm was a person of quiet service. The woman I am now is a person of sovereign strength. We are never too old to rise, never too broken to be remade, and never too lost to find our way home to ourselves. Share your story with us, because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear that survival isn't just possible, it's powerful. Someone needs to know they're not alone. Someone needs to understand that the end of one chapter can be the beginning of the most important chapter you'll ever write, the one where you finally become who you were always meant to be.